This is the reading and sermon from our service on Sunday the 22nd of March. The reading is from John chapter 9. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man or his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbours and those who'd formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought the Pharisees to the man who'd been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he'd received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man explained, "and I washed and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind. But now how he can see, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He's of age, ask him." A second time they summoned the man who'd been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know. I was blind, but now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I've told you already and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they'd thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Over the past few weeks, I've been preaching through John's Gospel, and I'm really enjoying doing that. And one of the things that I've noticed is how, in many of the stories, John sets up for us a contrast. In chapter 3, we have the story of Nicodemus, a well-respected religious teacher, part of the in crowd, who despite that doesn't really understand what God is doing. And he is contrasted with the woman at the well in chapter 4, an outsider who nevertheless recognises and accepts who Jesus really is. In chapter 4 and chapter 5, we have a contrast between two people who experience God's healing power but respond in very different ways. And today we have another contrast. A man born physically blind who becomes able to see, and a number of other people who can physically see but who are spiritually blind. The man born physically blind receives not only the gift of sight but also of insight. He alone recognises that Jesus is someone special, someone filled with the power of God. Something else I noticed in John's Gospel is how some of the characters are named while others are not. And those unnamed characters, like the woman at the well in chapter 4, the woman caught in adultery in chapter 8, and the blind man in today's story, are real people. But because they're not named, we can read these stories not just as stories of particular people transformed by Jesus, but actually as people who represent each of us. The woman at the well represents outsiders, people the rest of the world might ignore and overlook, who Jesus welcomes into his kingdom. The woman caught in adultery represents every person caught in a life of sin, every one of us who's messed up, fallen short of God's standard, and to whom Jesus offers grace and a chance to start again. And the blind man in today's story reminds us that without Jesus, we are all unable to see. We're all in the dark, but through Jesus, we can come into the light, begin to see and understand God more clearly. In fact, today's story is really an illustration of what Jesus says in John chapter 8, that he is the light of the world, that those who follow him will not walk in darkness, but instead have the light of life. So, let's have a look at what we can learn from some of the different people in this story that we have today. First of all, we have the disciples travelling along with Jesus when they encounter the man who was born blind. They ask Jesus a question about why it is that the man is blind. In their minds, the man's blindness must be the result of sin, and so they ask Jesus whose sin it is, the man's sin or his parents' sin. This is a question that people have wrestled with and still wrestle with today. We see suffering and we assume that it must be a punishment, it must be somebody's fault. Jesus sets them straight. The man's illness is not a punishment at all. And rather than being evidence of this man's sin, it's actually going to provide evidence of God's power and love. As an aside, we need to think about some of the issues around healing and just note them at this point. Although some sins and sinful behaviour might have a negative effect on our health, it doesn't necessarily follow that everyone who is ill in some way is ill because of something they've done. And Jesus makes that clear in this passage today. We also need to recognise that if people are ill in some way, it doesn't mean that they're not loved by God. St. Paul, for example, did great work for God, was clearly loved by God, but despite asking for healing, he continued to suffer what he called a thorn in the flesh. Paul actually wrote that he came to take pleasure in his infirmities because in his weakness, God's grace was seen. So if people are ill or suffering some way, it doesn't at all mean that they are not loved by God. The disciples were unable to see clearly what was going on in this story because they were focused on the immediate circumstances. All they could see was a poor, blind beggar. They couldn't see the potential and the possibilities of what God might do. Jesus invited them to see the bigger picture, to recognise that God had a bigger and greater plan in mind. How often, I wonder, are we, like the disciples, we focus so much on our small part of the world, on our own set of needs, our own circumstances, that we miss God's bigger story. Isaiah 55, 8-9 reminds us that God's thoughts are not our thoughts and his ways are not our ways. Jesus invites the disciples and us to broaden our vision. Second group of people who don't see things clearly in this story are the friends and neighbours of the blind man. And their problem is that they refuse to see. The man that they knew was blind. So if the man in front of them can see, they conclude it must be a different person. His friends and neighbours literally could not believe their eyes. They just can't believe that such a dramatic transformation can have taken place. It doesn't fit with their view of the world. They simply refuse to see it. They look for ways to explain away the miraculous change that God has brought. Again, we might sometimes have the same problem. The world we live in moves at such a pace. Often there is little time and space for God. We become so convinced of our own cleverness, our own independence, our own competence, that we shut God out. We no longer turn to God in times of difficulty, but instead we try to do things in our own strength. We don't give God the credit, and in fact, we stop expecting God to be at work. As our awareness of God working in our lives decreases, our expectation that God will work decreases too. We no longer expect to meet God when we come to worship. We no longer really believe that God will make a difference in our lives. Our hearts grow cold, the fire of faith goes out. Perhaps today we need to raise our expectations of what God can do. Over the past few months, I've been encouraging people to use the 30-day story journals that we've given out to help us begin to notice God again, to be aware of his presence in the simple everyday moments of life. I've been encouraging us to share our stories with one another, to talk together about what God is doing, both in the ordinary and in the extraordinary. The man born blind urges his friends to come and see and believe what God has done. The woman at the well in chapter 4 urges her neighbours, come and meet the man who has transformed her life. And the royal official at the end of chapter 4 tells his family and servants about God's healing power and invites them to believe as he does. As we share our stories and we see God at work around us, we rekindle the fire of faith. We increase our expectations of what God can do, and we'll quickly get better at recognising his presence and his power. The third group who don't see clearly are the Pharisees. Here is Jesus, filled with the power of God, bringing God's kingdom near to them, performing miracles, transforming lives, bringing life and healing and hope. And they are more concerned that Jesus might have broken the rules about the Sabbath. They couldn't see clearly because they couldn't see outside of the box. They thought that they were the experts on God, but their understanding of God was actually very limited. They'd made up their minds about how God worked, what God was like. They were trapped by their limited vision. What Jesus was doing was going against the way things had always been done, the way they believed things should be done. So they just couldn't see that here was God doing something new and something wonderful. We too can easily get stuck in a rut. Perhaps that's how some of us feel at the moment about our own faith. Perhaps that describes the church that we go to. We get so used to the way things are, the way we've always done things, that we can't see how God might be working in new ways. And we can't hear the call to change and to do things differently. These last few days have been days of turmoil, days of uncertainty, days which are shaking us up and perhaps which will shake us out of the ruts that we've become trapped in. The way things have always been is not the way things are now. things are changing and the church is changing too. We're having to think more creatively about what we do. We're having to reflect on what is really important to us. As all of our church activities have had to stop, perhaps this is a time to take stock, to ask ourselves some questions. In all that we've been doing, what are the things that really bring life? What are the things that have helped us grow in our faith? What are the things that we can't live without? And what are the things that are helping other people to find faith in Jesus? At the same time, we might discover that some things we've been doing in church or in our own personal lives were actually draining us of life, getting in the way of our relationship with God. And now we've been forced to stop those things for a while. Perhaps this is a chance to ask whether we ought to stop them for good. The invitation to the Pharisees was an invitation to open the box and to see the new things that God was offering. The last group who couldn't see clearly were the man's parents. When they were asked by the authorities about what had happened, they simply passed the buck. They couldn't see past their fear. What might happen to them if they expressed and confessed belief in Jesus? What would people think of them? What would people do to them? How often are we like the parents in the story, limited by our fears? Our fears of what people might say if we tell them that we're Christians. Fear that if someone asks us about our faith, we won't have all the answers. Or fear that if we let God into our lives, it means giving up control, allowing ourselves to be directed by what God wants instead of what we want. The man healed of his blindness didn't have those fears because God had transformed him. He didn't know all the answers. When they asked him the questions about theology, about sin, he didn't get into a debate about things he had no knowledge of. I don't know about any of that, he said. Here's what I do know. I was blind, but now I see. The man born blind wasn't afraid to speak out because God had changed his life. He wasn't afraid to speak out because he knew that God was on his side. He knew that God was real, God was at work, and God loved him. The Bible says God's perfect love casts out fear. And in Philippians 4, we're told not to be worried or frightened about anything, but simply to come to God. To come to a God who's for us. And as Paul writes in Romans 8, if God is for us, who can be against us? Of all the people in the story, the one person who did see clearly was the one who'd been set free by Jesus, the man born blind who had his life transformed. His life after that transformation wasn't necessarily easy. He had to adjust to a completely new world, a world he'd literally never seen before. He had to adjust to everything he'd known being completely different. He had to face opposition and persecution from those who were angry at what Jesus had done. Yet his life was now filled with the wonder of God. His eyes had been opened, not just physically, but spiritually. He'd seen God made real in Jesus Christ. Today's story invites us to allow God to open our eyes, to be transformed by the power of Jesus, so that we too can see God more clearly.